A nuclear missile has just exploded in Russia. Yup, the world is catching fire and Armageddon is here all right. Well, not yet for now. This was not an act of war. This was just Russia trying to show off its nuclear capabilities, and it went horribly wrong. Can you imagine the scenes at the Kremlin? Putin must be face-palming harder than ever. His military is supposed to project strength, but here they are doing epic fails, humiliating him in front of the world for all to see. The memes are already flooding in, and trust me, they're priceless. Putin's reputation is taking a deep dive that he may likely never recover from. More of that in a bit. It seems Russia is under the full effect of Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go, and wrong it has gone for Putin's precious mother Russia. From the failed march on Kiev to the Russian Air Force suffering from a high dose of friendly fire, shooting down its own aircraft, a mutiny on home soil, to Russia being invaded and losing a symbolic region to Ukraine, the Kursk region. The list of failures and mishaps is long, but it's the most recent mishap that has Putin standing at the center of the world, looking like the madman who cried wolf. The failed show of the Sarmat nuclear missile at Plesetsk Cosmodrome. More of that to follow in the video, so stay tuned and don't miss out on the chaos. Since the invasion of Ukraine began in February of 2022, there has been a noticeable pattern with Moscow. Whenever Russia feels threatened or under pressure from Ukraine and NATO, Putin goes on the mic and starts spewing nuclear war rhetoric, and such was with the recent nuclear missile test. Military drills and tests are the norm. Every major military power conducts them regularly. So what's the big hoo-ha with this one? As a response to the invasion of Kursk and the idea of NATO rethinking, allowing Ukraine to use its weapons to strike deep within Russian territory, Putin's biggest hype man, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, went on air, holding a press conference with Sky News, grandstanding on Russia's nuclear capabilities. This was another red line in a long list of red lines issued by Putin and his hype man since the invasion began. The basics of the message were simple. If NATO gives permission, that would mean NATO is at war with Russia. And just a reminder again, Russia is not afraid to use its nukes. On several occasions, Putin huffed and puffed his chest and threatened nuclear war escalation if certain red lines were crossed by NATO. Some of these red lines include the delivery of the HIMARS artillery system to Ukraine, the delivery of the ATACMS missile system, and the delivery of American and German tanks to the Ukrainian military. Putin went as far as ordering his nuclear armed forces to conduct tactical nuclear missile drills as a show of force to the West earlier this year, but NATO called his bluff, and all those red lines were ignored as usual. The world over, many experts and military analysts haven't taken Putin seriously since the first red line was crossed and no retaliatory action was taken. Just another instance of Moscow doing its regular saber rattling, trying to scare off the world with a rain of nuclear fire. One such expert is a retired lieutenant general in the United States Army, Frederick Benjamin Hodges, who offers his analytical opinion on why Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons is just a bluff, as it offers Moscow now legroom to wiggle. So much hype and attention was drummed up for the September 21st nuclear missile test, with big names in Russian politics such as Hype Man number 1 and Hype Man number 2, Dmitry Medvedev, who is a former president of Russia and now sits on the Security Council of the Russian Federation, conducting interviews and dishing out threats as usual.
Russia has been patient. It is obvious that a nuclear response is a hugely complex decision with irreversible consequences. What arrogant Anglo-Saxon dimwits fail to admit, though, is that you can only test someone's patience for so long. It will turn out in the end that certain moderate Western analysts were right when they warned, true, the Russians are not likely to use this response, although it's still a possibility. Besides, they may use new delivery vehicles with conventional payloads. And then, it's over. A giant blot of molten gray mass in the place where the mother of Russian cities, historical name of Kiev, once stood. Holy, it's impossible, but it happened.
They even had Sergei Lavrov on foreign television conducting question and answer sessions, preaching Russian propaganda and spreading the fears of the nuclear war if the West continues helping Ukraine. This is something Russia doesn't want, as it's slowing down their advances and making total victory in Ukraine impossible.
We talk about the red lines in the hope that our assessments and statements will be heard by clever decision makers. It is silly to say that we will push the red button if tomorrow you fail to do as I demand. I am confident that the decision makers are aware of what we mean in these situations. No one wants a nuclear war. We said this time and again. Let me assure you that we have weapons whose use will involve grave consequences for the masters of the Ukrainian regime. These weapons are available and on full alert status.
Not to be outdone by the West, Putin decided to up the ante and shift the nuclear rhetoric from tactical nukes to more powerful strategic nukes. For those who don't know the difference, tactical nukes are primarily designed for use on the battlefield to target specific military installations and troops. They have more or less the same yield as the bombs dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then comes the strategic nukes. These are specifically designed to scare your enemies into a stalemate and for retaliation purposes. These have the potential to while out entire cities and industrial centers in one hit. If NATO wasn't taking Putin seriously on him using atomic weapons to strike their troops, maybe, and just maybe, they would take him seriously if he hangs over their heads a big stick and they would stop meddling in Russia's affairs. The war would go his way and all would be well within the former Soviet state. After all, deterrence means having a bigger stick than the other guy, as it seems to be a common thing with Russia. Murphy's Law struck once again, and the test was a complete and utter failure. Calling it a test might perhaps be a bit of a stretch. Citing open source intelligence, the satellite images coming from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in Russia's Arkhangelsk Oblast show that the missile never left the ground and blew up in its storage silo. This explosion created a massive 60-meter wide crater and destroyed the launch facility. Images provided by Maxar Technologies show the surrounding tree line burning days after the test failed miserably. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has relied heavily on old and poorly maintained Soviet-era technology, which is prone to breaking down as seen in Ukraine, where most of this tech is deployed. So when Russia developed a new strategic nuclear missile and unveiled it in 2018, it quickly became Putin's pride and joy. Enter the RS-28 Sarmat, aptly named the Satan II by NATO because of its scary capabilities, which might create hell on earth. Let's unlock the inner geek in you and take a deep dive into its spec sheet. You're going to need it to fully understand the significance of this missile and the test itself. So let's see what all the noise surrounding it is all about. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense website, the Sarmat is the most technologically advanced and the most powerful nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, in the world. This kaiju-sized missile boasts an impressive launch weight of 35 tons, which is roughly 23 to 24 Uber taxis. The Sarmat can achieve a top speed of Mach 23, which is 23 times the speed of sound. If you're still crunching numbers here, let us help you. Mach 23 translates to 27,000 kilometers per hour and a range of 18,000 kilometers, meaning it can strike any location on the planet in under 10 minutes. Yeah, let that sink in. This monster of a missile carries 10 to 16 multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, MIRVs, meaning it can hit as many as 16 targets simultaneously. Each of these MIRVs carries a warhead with a yield of 50-60 megatons. This makes it a city killer, as it is capable of wiping out entire mid-sized cities. So what? All nukes can destroy cities, right? Well, this is where the missile truly earns its Satan name. Let's do a quick comparison. The bombs that devastated the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had yields of 15 kilotons and 21 kilotons, respectively. Still trying to wrap your head around it? How about this for perspective? A single Sarmat warhead has the explosive power equivalent to 3,000 Hiroshima-sized nukes and 2,800 Nagasaki-sized nukes, and the Sarmat carries up to 16 of these warheads. Yikes indeed. According to engineering experts, Sarmat II's advanced guidance system has the capabilities to bypass U.S. missile defense systems, meaning it can strike any location within the United States with ease. The missile's liquid-fueled engines provide rapid launch capability, ensuring a swift response to any and all potential threats. And it seems to be this liquid fueling capability that may have been its Achilles heel this time around. With a range of 18,000 kilometers, it means the Satan II requires a lot of fuel to travel this distance. Apparently, during a fuel process, before the tests even began, the missile suffered a catastrophic failure and exploded, destroying the storage silo and much of the test facility south of the Moscow region. Some might think it's just a failed missile test, so what's the big deal? Even Uncle Sam has had failed missile and other equipment tests, right? like the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent (GBSD) missile in 2020 or the SM-3 Block II missile in 2018. It's nothing new, and it happens all the time when testing new technology. Well, this is not just a missile test. It's the missile test, touted by Putin and his hype man as a game changer that will forever shift the geopolitical landscape and nuclear warfare as we know it. The RS-28 Sarmat II is relatively new with cutting-edge technology, with its first test flight in April 2022, barely 2 months after the Ukrainian invasion began. This would turn out to be the only successful launch. The 4 test launches that followed, including the September 21st, failed in dramatic fashion. The Sarmat test was supposed to be Putin's big moment to flex, a way to tell both the world and his people, hey, we've still got it. A successful test would have reinforced his image as the big boy resisting the West and steering Russia through stormy waters with sheer Soviet military might. However, all it achieved was the ability to generate questions. Is the Sarmat II Satan incarnate, or just a candle that fizzles out in the wind? Talk about an anticlimax. Of course, Russia, being an autocratic state, rarely admits to state failures on its part. Failure is not an option, and best to believe someone is going to pay for that failed missile test. And so far, the tune is coming out of Moscow. Nothing but silence on the matter. All evidence of the test failure has been gathered by open-source intelligence such as Planet Labs and Maxar Technologies, which have satellites passing over Russia, snapping images of the launch sites. And this latest failure couldn't have come at a worse time. At the peak of Putin's nuclear posturing, he has nothing to show for it except a 60 crater. The failed missile test wasn't just a hiccup in military technology, it was a political disaster for Putin. Right now, Russia is juggling more problems than a circus clown. With a case of shaky hands, it's starting to reveal cracks in Putin's regime. The Sarmat missile test wasn't just a technical failure. It was an embarrassment for Putin and Russia on the global stage. Talk about a bad place to embarrass yourself after all that hype. At the same time, the failure might put Putin in an awkward position, raising serious questions among Russia's BRICS allies. Countries like China, Iran, and other anti-Western states that have relied on Russia as a counterbalance to NATO's influence now have reasons to doubt. For these nations, the Sarmat's failure might create some serious doubts about Russia's ability to serve as a reliable security partner, potentially weakening Russia's standing in these critical relationships. No one probably felt the sting of the Sarmat missile's failure quite like the Russian President Vladimir Putin himself, who must be having the nightmare of his life, having spent 2 or so decades crafting his leadership around the idea that he's the guy who can restore and protect Mother Russia's strength, especially through its military. He has long presented himself as the fearless guardian of Russia's national interests, standing tall against Uncle Sam, ensuring that Russia never gets humiliated again. The military's success has always been the star player in that narrative, but when the Sarmat flopped, it didn't just fizzle out in the sky. It poked a big hole right through Putin's carefully built image. This wasn't just a case of, oops, there goes a missile, but rather a big dent in his strongman armor. With the war in Ukraine dragging on longer than anyone expected and sanctions from the West sinking their teeth deeper into Russia's economy, Putin has been leaning harder and harder on Russia's nuclear arsenal to prop up his political image. The Sarmat was supposed to be the shining symbol of Russia's nuclear dominance and, of course, of Putin's control over it all. In the high-stakes game of nuclear deterrence, presentation is everything. It's not just about whether a country has nuclear weapons or a bigger stick. It's about whether those weapons are reliable. Basically, can you swing that big stick you got and use it effectively if necessary? The Sarmat test was a chance for Russia to project that confidence. Instead, it threw shade on its nuclear program. The Russian economy is on a downturn, dragged down by Western sanctions and the costly price tag of the war in Ukraine, which the oligarchs can't seem to match, considering that NATO is using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine. Talk about a burner. Internationally, Russia's like the kid no one wants to play with, more isolated than it's been in years, facing global condemnation for its actions in Ukraine, while watching NATO beef up its presence in Eastern Europe. Try as he may to put up a brave face and preach about Russia's nuclear arsenal, the world has serious doubts about Russia's capabilities to rain fire. We have people like Peter Zeihan making making apt observations. If this is the new cutting-edge technology Russia has to offer and it's falling apart, the world over knows most of its technology is from the Soviet era, in simpler terms, ancient. What's the status of Russia's feared nuclear arsenal? Throughout the Russo-Ukrainian War, Russian military equipment has been known to break down. When the march on Kiev failed and thousands of Russian troops abandoned their equipment, the Ukrainians pounced on it. Hundreds of guns, tanks, and personnel carriers. This was supposed to be the jackpot. Chance for Kiev to pick up new gear, reverse engineer it, and add it to their arsenal. Then they examined this loot, and holy moly, was it absolute crap. Old, poorly maintained, downright obsolete. The mighty Russian war machine was nothing but a paper tiger breaking apart at the seams. Russia has a long history of corruption, and with corruption comes incompetence and negligence. If the Russian forces can't even do the bare minimum and maintain standard equipment, such as guns, tanks, and APCs, what more highly advanced technology such as ballistic missiles? One such instance of incompetence fueled by negligence and greed was the Wagner Mutiny of 2023. This was a key event that nearly brought Putin to his knees when his biggest ally, Prigozhin, turned on him, letting loose his private mercenary army on Russian troops and making a march towards Moscow. Elements high up in the Russian military, fueled by greed, wanted total control of the Wagner mercenaries, and when Prigozhin refused to do so, the Russian military bombed Wagner's camps, which were in the front lines in Ukraine, fighting Putin's war. This prompted a mutiny, with Wagner marching towards Moscow, stopping within a few hundred kilometers from the capital and calling the mutiny off. There is a segment done by the WION news network focusing on the key elements and reasons the mutiny arose in the first place. This was another embarrassment for Putin. His two biggest allies were fighting amongst themselves, and this was costing him the war in Ukraine. Another key event brought up by Russia's long history of corruption was the Kursk invasion in August 2022. Kursk Oblast, a region of strong Russian heritage dating back to the Second World War, was invaded by a small company of Ukrainian soldiers, quickly overrunning the defenses. This is unheard of. This event meant that Russia was the first nuclear power to be invaded. Clear Ukraine does not take Russia seriously, and neither fears its nuclear arsenal. The invasion of Kursk came about thanks to corruption in Russia. Government officials tasked with fortifying the border zone did what most corrupt officials do: pocket the money and do a piss-poor job of building and maintaining vital infrastructure which is needed for the defense of the motherland. It's almost tragic, if it weren't so comical, how far Russia has fallen. Once upon a time, Putin relished the role of global supervillain, flexing grand military muscle and playing chess with world leaders. It's now painfully evident that the Russian military is not exactly the well-oiled machine it was hyped up to be. Imagine being a supposed superpower and finding yourself begging for drones from a country that's been crushed under international sanctions for decades. Iran, one of the major international outcast states, stepped up to supply Russia with desperately needed kamikaze drones. Iran's Shahed drones may have made headlines for their participation in attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, but let's pump the brakes and not get too excited. These flying contraptions are more like glorified paper airplanes than high-tech marvels of engineering. Their effectiveness is, shall we say, less than stellar. The drones lack the precision and reliability that NATO's advanced equipment offers, proving that even in desperation, quality matters, something Russia doesn't seem to grasp. Here's the kicker. Putin once shrugged at the idea of needing anyone's help. He was the big bad, but now feels like a mini-boss, relying on Iranian drones that are about as reliable as your grandmother's driving. The Shahed may create a bit of chaos and commotion in Ukrainian cities, but when it comes to actual military efficacy, these drones have all the sophistication of a rock, little to none at all. The underlying message here is that when you start relying on a pariah state for your military hardware, it's a clear sign that your status as a superpower is in free fall. The nightmare only seems to continue for Putin, taking him deeper into the upside down. As if begging from Iran wasn't humiliating enough, the main course of Putin's embarrassment is served by none other than North Korea, one of the world's most isolated and economically impoverished countries. You know you've hit rock bottom when Kim Jong-un is like, "Hey buddy, need a hand?" Or more accurately, troops. Reports coming in from South Korea and Ukraine suggest that North Korea may be sending troops to join the fray alongside Russian forces. Let's break this down. North Korea is that one weird person that nobody wants to hang out with over the weekend, so they pretend they're an introvert. Over the decades, North Korea has mastered the art of isolation, not by choice, and in this nightmare, they're Putin's idea of a solid military ally. Sure, North Korea has a large military force in terms of manpower, but let's be real, what are they bringing to the table? Outdated equipment, which is far worse for wear than Russian gear. Soldiers who aren't exactly known for their training prowess. If you're thinking this is starting to sound like a buddy cop movie where neither of them can drive, well, you wouldn't be wrong, cause that's exactly what it is. Desperate times indeed call for desperate measures, and Putin's willingness to accept help from Kim Jong-un is a clear signal of just how low the Russian military might have sunk. The very idea of Russian troops fighting alongside North Korean soldiers feels like a fever dream. Imagine the conversations that would unfold. So do we have a battle plan, or are we just winging it? And as usual, whenever they find themselves in a pinch or awkward moment, they revert to nukes. All the big talk from former President Dmitry Medvedev about Russia being willing to use nuclear arms if any hostile action is taken against them. And yet for all that saber rattling and posturing from Moscow, they couldn't even defend their territory or keep true to their promises of nuclear fire. Why? Most likely because they recognize the ineffectiveness of their arsenal. He has statements from the US State Department mentioning that the nuclear rhetoric from Medvedev is just saber rattling, as the world knows not to take Medvedev seriously. Despite the failure of this nuclear missile test, we still have Russian state officials making bold claims of vengeance and fury. If NATO gets further involved by allowing Ukraine to use an advanced missile system, Moscow will retaliate against NATO, particularly Britain, and sink the island nation.
We are seeing is an attempt to substitute notions. Because this is not a question of whether the Kiev regime is allowed or not allowed to strike targets on Russian territory. It is already carrying out strikes using unmanned aerial vehicles and other means. But using Western-made long-range precision weapons is a completely different story. The fact is that I have mentioned this, and any expert both in our country and in the West will confirm this. The Ukrainian army is not capable of using cutting-edge high-precision long-range systems supplied by the West. They cannot do that. These weapons are impossible to employ without intelligence data from satellites which Ukraine does not have. This can only be done using the European Union's satellites or US satellites, in general NATO satellites. This is the first point. The second point, perhaps the most important, the key point even, is that only NATO military personnel can assign flight missions to these missile systems. Ukrainian servicemen cannot do this. Therefore, it is not a question of allowing the Ukrainian regime to strike Russia with these weapons or not. It is about deciding whether NATO countries become directly involved in the military conflict or not. If this decision is made, it will mean nothing short of direct involvement. It will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries are parties to the war in Ukraine. This will mean their direct involvement in the conflict, and it will clearly change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict dramatically. This will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are at war with Russia. And if this is the case, then bearing in mind the change in the essence of the conflict, we will make appropriate decisions in response to the threats that will be posed to us.
With Russia having backed out of the comprehensive nuclear tests ban treaty, Moscow is no longer bound by the terms of the treaty, and as such, can conduct nuclear tests whenever it pleases. On September 26th, headlines coming out of Moscow indicated that Russia was revising its nuclear policy. The report from First Post indicated that Russia was posturing again, putting on a brave face, but this time it was moving to protect its neighbor and ally Belarus.
We reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in the event of aggression against Russia and Belarus as a member of the Union State. All these issues have been agreed upon with the Belarusian side, with the President of Belarus, including if the enemy, using conventional weapons, creates a critical threat to our sovereignty.
If ever attacked, and the British allow Ukraine to use the Storm Shadow missile. Putin is amping up his nuclear rhetoric. In a highly televised interview, he made fresh claims, trying to change the narrative over the Ukrainian war, and as usual make fresh threats, hinting at direct conflict with NATO member states, especially those in a position to supply high-precision missiles to Ukraine. A British defense and history expert had something to say over the claims by Russia that it would attack Britain, reminding them that Britain and overall NATO has nukes too. For NATO, this failed missile test and other military blunders open up pathways for the West to be a little more confident in dealing with Putin's nuclear posturing. With Russia's credibility now shaky, NATO feels encouraged to step up its game in aiding Ukraine in its long, protracted battle against Russia. This entire saga might also encourage other emerging military powers like Turkey and India to pick a side and possibly lean towards the West, as opposed to their traditional neutral stance. This is all just speculation, but that decision may be in part influenced by Putin and Russia's failures to live up to the hype or even protect its own territory, making their nuclear threats weak sauce. As we witness this nightmare unfold, one thing is certain: Putin's nuclear posturing is failing spectacularly. His invasion of Ukraine is also following the same path, and his military desperation is becoming the stuff of legends. The world is laughing, and for the first time in a long while. It's not because of Putin's bravado, but because he's become the butt of a bad joke he once was so keen to tell. How this will play out in the future is anyone's guess, as war and geopolitics are highly volatile, especially in this era where with each day the world is faced with a new conflict, be it cultural and heritage wars in the Middle East and Asian, or civil wars and military coups in Africa. Till next time, stay safe and stay informed.